Hello everybody, this is Mr. Storm, and today we're going to do a new thing in Unity. It's going to be pretty cool actually. We're going to create a racing game. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to use something new called terrain, which is going to allow us to create a cool, realistic looking environment for our car to drive around in. And we're going to spend most of the time working on terrain, and actually getting the game working is going to be a lot faster than maybe you realize. Um, the first thing we need to do before we do anything in our scene here, we need this folder called Standard Assets. Now, Standard Assets is an assets package that Unity provides to everyone for free, and it has all kinds of characters and prefabs in it that we can use, and we need some of the textures and stuff from the Standards Assets package to create our terrain. So here's how to get the standard assets package. I don't know why I can't say that today. If you don't already have it in your scene, I loaded mine in whenever I created the game because I already had them downloaded and attached to my Unity account. But what you can do is, let's say you don't have this package here. What you need to do is go to the asset store. Now, the asset store is a window. It's essentially a window you can bring in. If you don't have it, you can go to Window, Asset Store, right there. And you can click that and it'll bring it in as a window. And this is the new look for the asset store. It's really cool. And if you haven't played around in the asset store yet, it's awesome. You can find all kinds of cool, um, you know, assets essentially in the asset store. Cool utilities that you can use, art assets, music, everything else. Ooh, look right here, top free package, standard assets. If you can't find this, you can also just do a search for standard assets, and it should be the first one. It's got this cool like little clip, icon here. If you click on it, then you should be able to download and import the asset. It is free, and again, this is something created by Unity. Now, it's going to take a while to install, to download and move over into your scene, or into your project. But once it's done, you should have this new folder called Standard Assets with all this stuff in it. Okay, great. Now let's get into actually creating our terrain. So what I want to do is go to Create, and I want a 3D object, and I want a terrain. So I'm going to click there. Now, it doesn't look like anything has happened, so I'm going to double click on that to see where it is. Ooh, looks like I'm way far out. Let me fly there. Come on. Fly, 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 fly. There we go. Now, the reason why it didn't look like there was anything going on was because I was underneath the terrain. Terrains are one-sided, so I'm above it now, which... Oh, why is my computer glitching out? All right, I'm above it now, which means I can see it, but if I fly below it, and it's a huge asset, so it's going to take a while and look up, I can't see anything. So if you can't see your terrain, you're probably underneath of it, which is, that happens. I'm going to click on the Y axis here so I can get a nice top-down view of my terrain. Now, this is where I'm going to put my... this is where I'm going to put all of my my grass and my rocks and my racetrack, and everything is going to be on this terrain. But first, let's take a look at the terrain itself. So I have my terrain object selected, and I can go over here to the inspector. Now, this is going to look different for you if you're using an older version of Unity. If it does look different, then don't panic. Just take a look at what you have versus what I have, and try to see if you can find the same things I'm working with. I'm trying to update all of the computers in the computer lab with the newer version of Unity, and you might get a notification when you open up Unity in the computer lab that says you're running an outdated version or older version. Do you want to update? It's probably best to click yes. That way you can get the update installed and out of the way. But if yours doesn't look like mine, then that's fine. Don't worry. Don't panic. It will it will look enough like mine to where you can do all the things I'm having you do today. All right, so I have my terrain. I'm going to click this gear icon here, which will give me all of these options for the terrain. Now, all of these are, really important, but not that important for what we're doing right now. For example, the grouping ID, I don't really need that. Cast shadows, sure, we want to cast shadows on things. The tree and detail objects, we're not worried about that because we don't have that in there. I can add more thickness into the terrain, but I don't care. I'm going to get rid of these options. Wind settings, yeah, we're going to deal with that later, but I'm going to leave it alone now. Mesh resolution on. This is the thing I want to really look at right here. We have terrain width and terrain length. By default, it's set to 500 by 500, which is great. That's what I want. That's what I'm going to use. But if you want a bigger or a smaller racetrack, then you would want to set this. Like, for example, if I want to double it, I can hit 1000 here and 1000 there. Now, down here, you can see it says baking ETA, and maybe it might be getting a little bit choppy just because we're rendering some stuff in real time. If my video gets choppy, I apologize, because while it's baking new textures and stuff, it's gonna take a lot of CPU and GPU power, so it's gonna take a lot from my rendering of my video. So sorry if the video gets too choppy. All right, so now I've made this double the size, which is going to make for a much bigger racetrack, but I actually don't want that, so I'm going to go back to 500. You can make yours bigger if you want, but again, it's it's up to you. The bigger your terrain, the more detail you have to add into it, and the more processing power you're going to take up to bake the scene. So this baking bar that shows up here, you always want to wait until that's done before you do something new. And depending on how powerful your computer is, that can take either a really long time or a short amount of time. Okay, cool. So I have my basic terrain set up. I just wanted to show you that so that you can play around with that. Because if we change the size of our terrain after we've already put in textures, it's going to stretch our textures out and make them look gross. So I want to make sure that I have my size set before I start dropping textures in. All right, well, let's talk about textures for a second. In your standards assets package, you have this folder called environment. Environment is going to have a couple things in here that we're going to want today. Terrain assets is what I want to look at right now. And we have billboard textures, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and surface textures. Surface textures is the folder we want right now. Let's see, that's a layer which I can get rid of because I will make that later. All right, grass layer I can get rid of. I'm just deleting some stuff that I've already built in here that I want to get rid of. I just want it to look more like what you have. Delete and delete, because we're going to create those. So your folder should have these 5 or 6 objects in them. You should have a cliff albedo. Albedo essentially is just a fancy word for color. It's technically color and alpha. Alpha is how transparent an object is. So a cliff albedo texture, a grass hill albedo texture, a grass rock albedo texture, muddy rock albedo, this muddy rock normal, which we'll talk about in a bit, and sand albedo. Now, at this point, it's up to you whether or not you want to create a desert racetrack, or like a beach racetrack, or a grass racetrack. I'm going to create a grass racetrack because it lets us have more fun later on with details. But you can create a kind of a hybrid. You can have some grass and some sand and some, all kinds of stuff. But I'm going to start with my base texture as this grass hill. So what I need to do is go over to terrain and click on this paint terrain button. Now again, if you're using an older version of Unity, you're going to have more paint brushes here. Just make sure you pick one that's close enough to the paint terrain. Just find the paint terrain options. And then I want to add a new brush. And the brush that I'm going to add, or nope, sorry. not smooth height. I have the wrong selector here. I want to paint texture, and I want to add a new terrain layer. I want to set edit and create layer. That's what I want to do. Make sure you have paint texture selected. And I'm going to type in the name of the texture I'm looking for. Grass. Okay, grass hill albedo. That's what I'm looking for. I'm going to double click that. And notice that it automatically paints my terrain for me. Because this is the first layer on my terrain, it's going to just assume that I want that grass layer on my terrain, and I do. Now, you always want a nice base layer for your terrain, because if you leave it that white, it's going to pop up sometimes underneath your grass, and it's not going to be good. So this base layer is a cool grass looking thing. And I'm going to actually zoom in. Oh, too much. And show you kind of what it looks like as we get a little bit closer. So if we get real close, and let me back up a little bit, we can see that the grass looks pretty nice, but it's not perfect. But it's okay, because that's just my base layer. We're actually going to fix a lot of that later on. Sorry, my dog's barking. All right, so I'm going to fix. Let's see. That's a good base. What I want to do is I want to actually create my racetrack. So this grass rock albedo texture is going to be a cool looking texture for my racetrack. So I'm going to create a new layer in my terrain layers. So create layer, and I'm going to look for this grass rocky albedo. Click there. Now notice it's not going to replace my base layer with that new texture, but what it will let me do is it'll allow me to use that texture in a brush. So notice that I have this kind of ghostly looking thing pop up underneath my cursor. That is the brush that I have right now selected. I want to actually select a different brush, and we have different brushes down here we can look at. This brush is going to create a nice feathering effect around my texture. This will create a feathering effect, but not as soft as that. And then even more. And then this is completely rough around the edges. We also have this scattering, kind of like a spray paint looking thing. We have star. We have all kinds of stuff. I'm actually going to grab, let's do this one right here. Now my brush is kind of large, so I'm going to actually bring it down to probably 30. The brush size, and then I'm just going to kind of paint a racetrack into my level. And it's literally just like you just start painting, right? So I'm going to paint there, and I'm going to paint here, and kind of do a double. Oh, I let go of the mouse button, and so now it's baking my textures on there again. That's okay. All right, and then come back here, and I'm going to do a loop there. And let's go right over here, and that's going to be a really tight turn. All right, sweet. So that's my racetrack. I know it doesn't look like much right now, but we're going to make it look really great when we start adding in the details. Okay, so, and actually let's zoom in here so we can see what that looks like on the ground. So I'm going to zoom in real close and kind of change my camera perspective so I can see. Now notice that I'm going to get rid of the brush. Let's go, sure, whatever. So notice that here, oh, come on. Let's go back to paint texture. That's fine, and I'll make my brush real small. All right, so notice that here along the edge where we painted that texture, it actually blends in with the grass really well. That's perfect. I love that. That's exactly what I want. But notice it's really flat and weird, right? We're going to actually add some dimension to this, some dimensionality to this in just a second. But I just wanted you to see that it blends real nice because we use that feathering brush. Now another thing I want to look at is when we look here, we can see that with the grass, you can kind of see the textures repeating, and here you can kind of see that as well. What we can do in order to avoid that or fix that so that it doesn't look weird like that is we can go down here to our new layer 1, which is our rocky texture. And over here in the tiling settings, we have our size. And if we change the X and Y size of that texture, it'll actually change how stretched out the texture is. So one of these textures here is going to actually encompass 6 on the X and 6 on the Y, so it makes the texture bigger, which if we make it too big, it'll be really gross looking. But for our racing game, it's better if it's bigger so that we don't see the repeating texture over and over again, because we're going to be moving really fast. We're not going to see a lot of detail on this road anyway. All right, so I'm going to back up and show you. So it looks a lot better now than it did. Okay, cool. And just play around with the settings on these textures. You know, it's going to take a while to make it look exactly the way you want, but you know, the more you play around with it, the more you learn what you can do. Okay, so now that I have my overhead view of this, I want to actually start thinking about where I want to place some cliffs. So first of all, I definitely want cliffs around the edges here, so you can't see outside of the 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 box here. I want it to look like it's. I don't want the terrain to just drop off. You know, the world isn't flat, and I don't want I don't want it to look like it's flat. So I'm going to take this cliff albedo texture here, and I'm actually going to create a new layer, a new terrain layer, using this cliff albedo texture. And it's cliff albedo specular. All right. And with this cliff albedo specular layer selected, I'm going to grab a brush that looks pretty good. And I can just keep the same one that I have, set my size to a little bit bigger. And I'm just going to, oh, what did I do? I clicked outside the terrain. I'm just going to paint that cliff around the edges. And remember, every time you unclick what you've been doing, it's going to try to bake in the new thing. And again, it's probably getting pretty jittery in the video, so I apologize. It's going to be pretty jittery for kind of the rest of the video because we're doing more graphically intensive stuff. So I apologize if the video gets almost impossible to watch. All right, and I'm just painting in textures around the edges here so that we can have a cliff that goes around the entire thing. This is going to be, it's going to feel like you're in like on top of a mountain because you're enclosed on all sides by mountain. And if it gets to be like you're too close to the edge here, you can just, you know, drop your brush size down a little bit. All right, and paint that in. Nice. All right. Don't be worried if you end up going over your track a little bit with your rocky texture. Now this texture is going to look super gross if we were to zoom in on it right now, which, you know, I'll go ahead and do that actually. If we look here, this texture is not meant to be repeated over and over again like this. So we're going to actually fix that with our tiling settings here in a minute. But first, what I want to do is I want to actually, oh, that's not what I wanted. There we go. First, I want to actually add some height here because this is supposed to be, those are supposed to be cliffs. So I actually want to add some cliffs. What I can do is come over here to my options and select raise or lower terrain. This brush is going to allow me to increase the terrain in this area. Okay, now we want it to be kind of like a sloping cliff. So the farther out sections are going to be higher than the closer sections. I'm actually going to increase my brush a bit here. Now this tool is really difficult to master. So please be careful when you're using this tool. You're going to create some, you know, some cool stuff with this, but you can also go a little bit overboard with it. So try not to go too crazy with it. If you hold it down for longer than just a click, then you're going to create some really, really high terrain. So you just have to play around with it until you can get used to using it properly. So create more here, some more cliffs here, and we'll go here. Now, if I were to zoom in on that, oh, what happened there? If I were to fly in on that, there, let me zoom in actually. It's easier. I can see that I now have some cliffs here, and I can actually raise it up a little bit more on that, and probably, yeah, I might actually paint in more textures there for the cliff side. But I just created kind of a, a rock barrier. But along these edges, it's still flat. So what I can do is shrink my brush down and just kind of, oh, see, I held it down for too long. You just want to click, oh, too long. Click, 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 click. Now we get this weird uneven, these jagged things. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to Control Z all of that because it looks weird. And I'm going to use this tool here called, oh, give it a second, it's baking. All right, I'm going to use this tool here called Set Height. Set Height allows me to set a specific height for my terrain. I'll set 10. And then the tool allows me to set the terrain to that height all the way through. All right, now this is kind of cheating and it looks really weird right now, but I'll show you how to fix it and make it look better in just a minute. So I'm only going to do one edge because I don't want to spend too much time. Actually, I'm going to undo that. I'm only going to do one edge because I don't want to spend too much time on this. But notice how it's really weird and gross looking here. We can use this other brush called Smooth Height to smooth out that height so that it looks a lot more natural. So we're smoothing that height out. Smooth, smooth, smooth. And we'll smooth a little bit more here, smooth it out. All right, now we want to fix that texture so it doesn't look so weird. So I'm going to go into my new layer 2, which is my cliffside. And I'm going to set the tiling settings to 10 by 10, and that looks a whole lot better. We could probably even make it a little bigger than that, but whatever looks good to you. Probably 12 by 12. We'll try that. That looks even better, I think. Okay, and my video's choppy up. It's chopping up again. All right, and I just looked at the timer and I realized how much time I've spent on this part so far. So I'm going to very quickly go through the rest of the stuff you can do with terrain and let you kind of just develop your own. I'm going to stop trying to make this so nice looking. So I'm going to leave mine alone. Now you don't have to do a barrier around the whole thing. That's just kind of what I do just to make it feel more enclosed. All right, so some other things you can do. You can add some terrain in here and make it a little bit bigger or smaller. You can add some jumps in here by adding your terrain, by raising or lowering your terrain. Again, be careful with that because it can get kind of out of control. I want to create, let's go into terrain. Let's talk about some of the other things we can do. I'm going to paint texture. I'm going to edit and create another terrain texture, and I want to create this mud texture. Now let's talk about this mud texture here real quick. I'm going to add this in, but I'm also going to do something new that we haven't seen before called normal textures. I'm going to use a normal texture for this mud. So down here in layer 3, which is my mud texture, we have this option called normal map. And I'll give my video a second to catch up. All right, so I have this option here called normal map. Now a normal map, what it does is it's an extra layer on that texture that kind of just makes it look a little bit more natural. It gives it more of a 3D look. With this game, you're not really going to notice a big difference, but in the next game that we work on, you're really going to notice it. And so I want to show you what a normal map does. So right down here, we have mud, rocky, normal. And it's set as a normal map, and it's set to create from grayscale, which means it's going to be a little bit more 3D. So if I go back to my terrain and I go back to that, oh no, I go back to the texture here, I can actually just drag this normal map into my mud. And when I paint that on, it's going to look a bit different than some of these other textures I've been using. So I'm going to go to my terrain. I'm going to grab this. Come on. Yeah, I'm going to grab that. And I'm going to, yeah, that's a fine enough brush size, and just paint in my mud. Now it's looking kind of gray and gross, so I'm going to fix that in just a second. But my mud is down there. I'm going to zoom in on it so we can take a look at it up a little bit more up close. Okay, and again, the texture repeating on that is pretty gross. So maybe we want to set that to a different value. So let's go to that layer, set this to maybe 6 by 6. That's a little better. All right, so now if you look, this has more of kind of a 3D bumpiness to it. It's because of that normal map that we added onto it, but we can do some cool stuff with it. We can make it a little bit different. First of all, I want to fix it so it's not gray. So if I go to the specular and I find this, make it kind of brownish, you're not going to notice too much of a difference once it gets done baking. Come on. All right, so you're not going to notice much of a difference when I changed it to brown, but when I change the metallic setting on this and increase it, you're going to notice more of that brown coming in. So I'm just going to find an area that looks good. Yeah, that's pretty good. And I can actually smooth it out a little bit more, but I think that looks pretty good for now. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I like that. Now, again, a lot of this is just playing around with it and finding something that looks good to you. All right, so I'm going to back out. So there's my mud section. Let's talk about grass and trees, because grass and trees are really important, and they're the only things we haven't really done yet. First of all, I'm going to do grass. Let's go to my terrain, and we have this button here called Paint Details. Now, to paint details onto a scene, we need to actually have a billboard texture for our details. So I have Paint Details selected. I have no detail objects defined, so I'm going to go to Edit Details and add a grass texture. Now it's going to ask me to define a grass texture, but I don't want to grab this one because this one's a flat texture. I want a billboard texture. So I'm going to go to my terrain assets and billboard textures. And I have a couple of different, I'm going to get rid of this. I have a couple of different textures here. I have this really dense, kind of cool looking green one, and I have this kind of sparse looking sprig grass looking thing. I'm going to use this one actually. I'll go back to my terrain, go back to edit details, and add grass texture. Now I can just drag this right up here into the detail texture. And I can change some stuff about it here, change the healthy color and the dry color and all that. But I'm just going to leave all those at the natural settings and click add. And it's going to bake. And baking, baking, baking. All right. So now when I have this selected, I can set my new brush. I'll set it to, sure, 100. Sure, that looks good. I can also change my target strength, which is going to change how strong or how like dense the grass is. And I also want, instead of that circle, I just want like a sporadic, like, let's see, maybe something like that. That looks cool. And I'm just going to click. Now, notice nothing, it doesn't look like anything happened, but if I zoom in here to where I clicked, I can now see that I have grass, the sporadic looking grass, just kind of wherever I put it. Now, the reason why you can't see that far into the distance is because if I go to my terrain settings and come down to here, this option, detail distance, it's set to a lower setting. That's to help me save on my CPU draw whenever I'm creating my textures or creating my terrains. But I can actually extend that out to 250 so I can see the farthest into the distance that I want. All right, I'm going to go back up here to paint details, and I can just kind of click in here and add some more grass, and it's going to end up on my racetrack, but that's okay. And you can play around with this and add as much grass or as little grass as you actually want. Again, that's how you do it. You add grass. And notice that there are different details in the grass. Like there's healthy grass and there's brown grass. We can set that different that variation whenever we create our new grass. Okay, cool. So that's a very easy way to quickly create a bunch of cool looking 3D grass. Alrighty. The last thing I want to get into before I end this super long video is I want to talk about trees. We need to add some trees into this to make it really nice looking. So I'm going to go over here to paint trees, and I need to find a cool tree that I like. We have 3 different kinds of trees we can choose from. We have a broadleaf, which we have, hold on, let's go back. Speed trees. There we go. We have broadleaf, which is kind of a standard broadleaf looking tree. We also have conifers, which are they're more like they're tall with, you know, their leaves are up at the top. Then we have palm trees, which you know what palm trees are. I'm going to go with conifers here. And just make sure you have that folder open. I'm going to go to terrain, and down here I can click edit trees and add tree, and just drag that conifer right in there and click add. And now it's really as easy as this. You click and you add trees. That's really how easy it is. You can click and add trees. Now, there's some things we want to pay attention to here. Obviously, our brush size, if we want to add trees to a wider area, we can just click there. Now, with trees, sometimes they go outside of your brush indicator there, so you want to be careful when you're adding trees to make sure your brush size is a little smaller than you expect. So there we go. Notice how it added trees outside of where I clicked. The other thing we can look at here is tree density. Maybe you don't want too many trees in the area, you just kind of want it sparsely populated. You can click, or you can slide down tree density, and it can, you know, they're a little bit less populated. I'm going to slide that down even further and make my brush size smaller, and notice it's only popping in 2 trees. Oh, I clicked twice, that's why. Okay, so that's a little better. All right, I'm going to stop playing with trees so much. Let's see, tree height is awesome. This slider here, you can set how wide you want your tree's variation to be in the height. So like if I set it real high and real low, and I click here, notice that now I have some really tiny trees and I have some really tall trees. That's pretty cool too. And I want the trees to randomly rotate as well. I don't want them all facing the same way. But now we have these trees. It's probably better if we had some kind of wind blowing through here to move our trees. So what we need to do is go to Create, 3D Object, and I want to create a wind zone. So I'm going to create a wind zone. And what I can do is I can change the directional mode of my wind. I'm just going to keep it directional. Let's find that object. Where did it go? All right, we're going to bring it up here so it's easier to play with. And zoom on it again. And it's going to be blowing my wind in that direction, which is okay. And this is just like a directional light. It doesn't matter where it is. It's just good to see it so you can see which direction it's blowing. So it's going to be blowing wind in that direction. And let's set the turbulence a little higher, maybe to 3.19 or just 3, that's fine too. Pulse magnitude, pulse frequency, all that's good. Now if we were to actually go into our game mode, it's hard to see because my camera's in a weird spot, but we'll actually see this when we're playing. So that's my wind zone. What else do I need to talk about? I think that's pretty much it when it comes to building our track. Now, obviously mine looks weird and gross, and yours isn't going to be as weird and gross as mine. But I want to show you the last couple things we need to do to get this game actually working. So what I'm going to do is I am going to bring in my car. And this is going to go very quickly. So in the standard assets folder, we also have this thing called vehicles. And in vehicles, we have aircraft and car. We're going to bring in a car. And if we go to our prefabs, we have our car prefab. And we can just bring that in and drop it right there in our scene. I'm going to double click on that and zoom in. Okay, now he's facing the wrong way, so I need to position him properly. So I'm going to, oh, I went too far. I'm going to position him properly so he's facing down the track. So let me grab my rotate tool, and I'm going to rotate him on the X. Oh, that's movement. I want to rotate him. Nope, not on the X, on the Z. Nope, not on the Z. One second, on the Y. I'm going to rotate him on the Y so he's facing the right way. And the last thing I want to do is set the main camera as a child of my car. And when I do that, I can zero out the camera's positional values, which will put it right dead center in the middle of the car, which means I got to move it up and bring it back. Oh, it's faced the wrong way, so let's rotate the camera here. All right, bring it back so I can see the car. Let's slide it over here. I actually want to bring it back just a little bit more. Let's go there, that looks good. And bring it up a little bit, that looks good. Bring it back on the Z a little bit more. That looks better. And I might actually bring it up even more and angle it down just a little bit. Rotate it down just, oh, not that way. Rotate it down just a little bit. All right, so now everything should work. If I click play, I should be able to play my game. So there's already controls, there's already sound effects, there's already, everything we need because this is a prefab built by Unity, right? And so I can drive on my racetrack and I can check out my cool scenery. Now if I stop here for a second and we look, notice that the wind is blowing these trees around, which is exactly what I told it to do with that wind zone. So I'm just going to keep driving around here, look at more of our details. Oh, one thing I did forget to add in was water. I was planning on adding some water here. So very quickly before I stop, this is almost a 40-minute long video. I'm not going to show you exactly how to do it, but what you can do here is in the environment folder, there's also this option called water, and you can just bring in a water prefab and just kind of move it where you want it and make it as big as you want. And it's pretty easy to use. I actually can use this a lot easier to use this. We can put some water underneath make kind of a swampy-ish area here. And that water will actually look really good when we play the game. But anyway, so that's how you add water. So play around with your terrain, make a really cool looking racetrack. All of our cars are going to be the same, but your creative contribution to this project is going to be making a really cool terrain, really cool racetrack. All right, that's it for me. Thank you for suffering through this 40-minute long video. Oof, sorry about that. I will, that's the whole project. So when you're done, turn it in the way you normally do. Make sure you build your project first so I can play around in it. And I will see you next time. Thank you for paying attention.